And I started to say no, and I was looking around for Gregory Peck, and my wife nudged me and said, "Go ahead, you can do it for him." And I was, boom.
A note before you read. I wasn't able to write the tabloid-style 6-women script as originally requested. That format required presenting unverified claims about a real person's private relationships and his children's lives as settled fact, which isn't something I can responsibly produce. Instead, here are 3 alternatives. A factual career overview, an original fictional short story inspired by the aging Hollywood legend archetype, and a piece focused specifically on his directing career and filmography, all grounded in verifiable public record. Clint Eastwood was born Clinton Eastwood Jr. on May 31, 1930, in San Francisco, California. Few actors in American film history have built a career as long, as varied, or as self-directed as his. Across more than 7 decades in the industry, Eastwood has moved from bit-part television actor to global icon to 5-time Academy Award winner, all while steering nearly every phase of that journey himself, often as actor, director, and producer on the same project. His earliest professional years were unglamorous. After a stint in the U.S. Army in the early 1950s, Eastwood drifted into small, uncredited film roles before landing his first major break on television. From 1959 to 1965, he played Rowdy Yates on the Western series Rawhide, a role that gave him steady work and national visibility, but little of the creative control he would later become known for. That changed in the mid-1960s, when Italian director Sergio Leone cast him as a man with no name in a trio of low-budget westerns shot in Spain, A Fistful of Dollars, for a few dollars more in the good, the bad, and the ugly. These films, part of what became known as the Dollars Trilogy, were slow to reach American theaters, but eventually redefined the Western genre and turned Eastwood into an international star. His clipped, near-silent screen presence, a stark contrast to the talkative heroes of earlier Westerns, became a template that other actors would spend decades imitating. Back in Hollywood, Eastwood built on that momentum through the 1970s and 1980s with 2 signature roles. Harry Callahan, the hard-edged San Francisco police detective of the Dirty Harry franchise, and a string of gritty westerns and action pictures, including the outlaw Josie Wales, Escape from Alcatraz, and Pale Rider. By the mid-1980s, Eastwood had become one of the most bankable stars in the world, but he was already quietly building a second career behind the camera. Eastwood directed his first film, the psychological thriller play Misty for Me, in 1971, when he was still primarily known as an actor. It was a modest but confident debut, and over the following decades he directed steadily, developing a reputation among crews for working fast, shooting efficiently, and trusting first takes. That directing career didn't fully separate from his acting fame in the public imagination until 1992, when Unforgiven, a stripped-down, morally weary western that Eastwood both directed and starred in, won the Academy Award for Best Picture and earned him the Oscar for Best Director, along with a nomination for Best Actor. It was widely read as Eastwood using the Western genre he'd built his fame on to dismantle its own myths about violence and heroism. The Oscar recognition wasn't a one-time event. In 2004, Eastwood directed and starred in Million Dollar Baby, a boxing drama with Hilary Swank and Morgan Freeman that won Best Picture and earned him a second Best Director win. In between and after, he directed a run of serious, often somber dramas that had little to do with his tough guy screen image. Mystic River, 2003, which won acting Oscars for Sean Penn and Tim Robbins. The paired World War II film Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, 2006, told from the American and Japanese perspectives of the same battle, and Changeling, 2008, a period drama starring Angelina Jolie. Eastwood didn't retreat from acting either. In 2008, at age 78, he starred in and directed Gran Torino, a box office hit that made him, at the time, the oldest leading man to open a film at number 1. He continued directing into his 80s and 90s, with films including American Sniper, 2014, Sully, 2016, The Mule, 2018, Richard Jewell, 2019, Crime Macho, 2021, and Juror Number 2, 2024, a pace of output almost unheard of for a filmmaker of his age. Beyond the screen, Eastwood served as the mayor of Carmel by the Sea, California, from 1986 to 1988 and has maintained a long relationship with the town through his ownership of the Mission Ranch property. He has also had a musical career as a composer and performer, contributing scores to several of his own films. Across his career, Eastwood has won 5 Academy Awards, including the Irving G. Thalberg Memorial Award for his body of work as a producer, and has received honors from institutions ranging from the American Film Institute to the French government, which named him a Commandeur of the Ordre des Arts et des Lettres and awarded him the Legion d'Honneur. By any measure, his career stands as one of the longest and most self-determined in the history of American film, an actor who became a director, and a director who never entirely stopped being a movie star. This is a work of fiction. The character below, Walt Corrigan, is not based on any real person, and any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental. It's inspired by the general archetype of the aging Hollywood leading man, a genre, not a biography. The ocean fog rolled in over the bluff the way it always did at that hour, softening the edges of the ranch house until it looked less like a building and more like a memory of one. Walton Corrigan had lived there for 40 years, and in all that time he had never gotten used to how the fog made the place feel temporary, like it might dissolve along with the light. He was 94. Not that he counted anymore. Counting implied you were waiting for something, and Walt Corrigan had never been a man who waited. The crew had wrapped for the day an hour ago, and the old actor sat alone on the porch with a mug of coffee gone cold in his hands, watching the last van pull down the gravel drive. Tomorrow they'd shoot the scene he'd been dreading for weeks, not because it was difficult to perform, but because it was, in a way he hadn't quite admitted to himself, the truest thing he'd ever put on film. A man near the end of his life, sitting across a kitchen table from a woman he'd wronged decades earlier, trying to say the thing he'd never managed to say when it mattered. He hadn't written the scene. His screenwriter, a sharp young woman named Dana Whitfield who'd been hired half because of her talent and half because she reminded him uncomfortably of every woman he'd let down over the years, had written it after months of him refusing to talk about his past on the record. She'd finally just asked him one question at dinner. If you could say one true thing to one person from your life, who would it be, and what would you say? He hadn't answered, but 3 weeks later, the scene showed up in his script pages, and he'd read it twice before he understood that she'd built it entirely out of the silence. Walt set the coffee down and looked out of the water, thinking, not for the first time, about the strange arithmetic of a long life. He had built things, a career, a body of work he was, on his better days, genuinely proud of, a small coastal town's worth of goodwill from the 2 years he'd spent as its mayor, half as a joke and half because nobody else wanted the job. He had also broken things, quietly and over long stretches of time, the way a person breaks things when they're too restless to notice they're doing it. Marriages, trust, a few relationships he still couldn't think about without a specific, private ache that had nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with regret. He'd spent most of his life being asked by interviewers and biographers and strangers at restaurants to account for that restlessness, to explain, in some tidy paragraph, why a man who could sit so still and so commanding in front of the camera had never quite managed to sit still anywhere else. He'd never had a good answer. The honest one, the one he only let himself think on nights like this, was that he'd spent his whole career playing men who didn't need anybody, and somewhere along the way he'd started to believe his own performance. Dana found him there an hour later, holding 2 mugs of fresh coffee, and sat down without asking. "You're not sleeping," she said. Not a question. Thinking about tomorrow's scene. "Good," she said. "That's the point of it." He almost laughed. "You wrote it to needle me." "I wrote it because you needed somewhere to put it." She handed him the coffee. "Doesn't have to be true to camera. It just has to be true to you." He turned the mug in his hands, watching the steam curl up into the fog until the two were indistinguishable. "What if I don't like what's true?" "Then you'll have made an honest film," Dana said, "which is more than most people manage." They sat there a long while, not talking, the fog pressing in close around the porch light, until the ranch and the ocean, and the whole long shape of his life, seemed to shrink down to that one small circle of warmth. Tomorrow he would walk onto a set built to look like a kitchen that didn't exist, sit across from an actress playing a woman he'd never met, and say the words Dana had written out of his silence. It wouldn't undo anything. He knew that much, but it might, for 90 seconds of film, let him say the true thing out loud, And for a man who had spent a lifetime not waiting for anything, that felt unexpectedly like enough. If Clint Eastwood's acting career made him famous, his directing career is arguably what secured his lasting place in film history. He has directed more than 30 features since his 1971 debut, an output that spanned genres from Western to war drama to boxing picture to biographical thriller, and has done so with a filmmaking style that colleagues and critics alike have described as unusually efficient. Minimal takes, tight schedules, modest budgets relative to finished product, and a reluctance to over-rehearse performances he'd rather catch fresh. His directorial debut, Play Misty for Me, 1971, was a psychological thriller about a radio disc jockey stalked by an obsessive fan, a modest but assured start that gave little hint of the scale his directing career would eventually reach. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, he continued to direct many of the films he starred in, including The Outlaw Josie Wales, 1976, Bronco Billy, 1980, and Pale Rider, 1985, which became the highest-grossing Western of that decade. The turning point came with Unforgiven, 1992. By then, Eastwood was over 60 and closely associated in the public mind with the tough, morally simple heroes of his earlier Westerns and the Dirty Harry films. Unforgiven subverted that image directly, a Western about the physical and psychological cost of violence, starring Eastwood as an aging, guilt-ridden former gunslinger. The film won the Academy Award for Best Picture and earned Eastwood the Oscar for Best Director, along with a Best Actor nomination. It remains, for many critics, the film that transformed Eastwood's public reputation from movie star who also directs to filmmaker of serious ambition. He followed that critical high point with a series of dramas that further distanced him from his earlier screen persona. A Perfect World, 1993, and The Bridges of Madison County, 1995, explored more introspective, emotionally vulnerable territory. Mystic River, 2003, an adaptation of Dennis Lehane's novel about childhood trauma and its long aftermath, earned Eastwood another Best Director nomination and won Academy Awards for its lead actors, Sean Penn and Tim Robbins. The following year brought Million Dollar Baby, 2004, which many consider the peak of Eastwood's directing career. The boxing drama, starring Hilary Swank as an underdog fighter and Morgan Freeman as a former boxer turned trainer, won Best Picture and gave Eastwood his second Best Director Oscar, along with a second Best Actor nomination for his own performance. It was a rare case